supposedly, as a professor of finance who knows statistics and knows data, should I be immune? But I'm not, so I make a lot of mistakes. So one of them was when I heard about this 10,000 hours rule by Malcolm Gladwell. So I went to a talk at Wharton, so that was a business school in the US, which I used to teach at, and they had this great series called Peer Perspectives on Leadership, where some students who'd done some amazing things would tell you about their life lessons. And so there was one guy who had been in Cirque du Soleil, so he was an amazing acrobat. And he talked about, well, how did he become able to do these one-armed handstands? It wasn't due to being born with some special gene or being double jointed. He said it was practice. And he said, well, there is this 10,000 hours rule that if you practice something and you try hard enough, then you will become perfect at it. And again, that was consistent with what I've been brought up to be told, right? Practice makes perfect. You can do anything you put your mind to. And I didn't just take his word for it. I read Malcolm Gladwell's book, and this looked at all of the evidence behind this 10,000 hours rule. And then I started to teach it to my own students. So even though later on I found that this was not true, I taught it to my students because I said, look, you come to your MBA program, maybe your background is not in finance, but this is something where you can reinvent yourself and learn something new. And I just get nods every time I spoke, as if this 10,000 hours rule was a truth university acknowledge. But then a few years later, when I moved back to the UK, I started this part-time job at Gresham College. So this is an unusual institution. You can't get a degree there. They just give free lectures to the public, like Michael Faraday gave on science. And perhaps the most famous Gresham professor recently is Sir Chris Whitty, so the chief medical officer who helped us fight the pandemic. At the same time, he was giving free lectures on epidemiology through Gresham College. And so I wanted to give a lecture on the growth mindset, the idea that if you work at something, you'll do better. And so I went back to the Outliers book and just read it a little bit more carefully. And I realised that the evidence did not support anything that he was claiming. So there was no mention anywhere of 10,000 hours in the underlying paper. There was no mention or measure of success. And also the study was purely on violinists. So what leads to success in violin playing might not lead to success in completely other fields. So he just extrapolated from this one particular study and then used that to claim this universal rule and fooled even people like me. And so it was my fault for having just believed this without being as critical as I was the second time round.
How did it make you feel?
So I first just felt rather embarrassed about this. And I thought, well, is it actually not too bad? Because the general idea that practice makes perfect, isn't that a good thing to get out? Does it matter if something is completely 100% accurate? But I think it still matters, because one of the problems with the 10,000 hours rule is it suggests that what matters is the quantity of practice, right? So just like we like to gamify everything, we want 10,000 steps at the end of the day. Can we quantify the number of hours that we do? And so let's say you want to become a great tennis player. I used to just knock the ball around with my friends and just play in that way. But actually that's very different to playing a game just and keeping score, because you're playing a game and keeping score. You're not going to whack the ball as hard as possible. You're going to do something a bit more sensible with a greater percentage chance of being in. You're going to practice serving, which many people just don't like to practice. They just like to hit the ball out of their hands. So it's quite different from being in a more difficult, challenging situation rather than knocking the ball around. Going back to music, there's a difference between a jam session and a deliberate rehearsal where you're trying to work for a particular goal.
But with bias, does it make sense if something seems logical? Does it always have to seem logical? So, for example, if you do 10,000 hours of playing football or tennis, you're going to get better you're going to be better. If I try and learn like Japanese for 10,000 hours, I already speak French. I was going to say French. I might already speak French. If I don't learn like something...
If you learn Japanese for 10,000 hours, end up speaking French, so it's gone right.
But shouldn't it be something believable? Because you said you found it a bit embarrassed, but it is quite believable that 10,000 hours you should get
Surely
better
practice does make you better.
Yeah, so because it's so logical, you don't really question it. And again, practice does make you better to some degree. So I think the general idea is still holds that practice is useful. But the idea that it's just the quantity of practice that matters, or you can't be successful unless you've put a lot of time in. So why did that message also resonate? Because when we look at really successful people, we like to believe that they had to get there through a lot of sweat and grit and hard work, when actually sometimes they can be people who are naturals, right? If you do something that you are naturally talented at, that is perhaps better than trying to always struggle to get to the top. But we like books with like single explanations. So we say this is the one way to become successful when it's a myriad of things. So practice still works, but just to practice and think that I could become sort of a pop star right now if I just work on my singing, that is completely implausible. Instead, yes, you can branch out into other things if you put the time in, but they still have to be related to your core strengths and your core competencies. And again, this is one of the problems where people get excited with crypto or any type of investing just because it's a fad without past experience in it. They're not really looking at the importance of expertise, not just passion.
I love learning about bias and misinformation. I think anyone who watches stuff on YouTube or consumes mainstream media on any platform where there's an algorithm should really learn about it too. Click here to watch the full interview.